It takes 20 years before something becomes history. The distance matters. It gives us time to contextualize events instead of relying purely on emotion in the moment. For years, I collected newspaper front pages from events that I believed would become defining historical moments. Presidents elected, popes chosen, wars begun, tragedies unfolding. But after about a decade, I realized I had badly overestimated some of those moments, especially school shootings. I had around 10 different front pages commemorating different massacres, each one presented as a turning point, and yet none produced any major shift in policy. Whenever somebody attempts to act in the aftermath of a mass shooting, they're accused of politicizing a tragedy that should never become political in the first place. September 11th was different. Even in the moment, Americans understood that the attacks would have consequences stretching far beyond the usual 20-year waiting period we use to process history. We knew it instantly. This would be remembered forever. It would join Pearl Harbor and the Kennedy assassination as one of those defining moments where Americans came together, where politics briefly stopped in the face of national tragedy. At least that was the hope. In June of 2025, Zohran Mamdani won the Democratic primary for mayor of New York City. Mamdani, the son of practicing Muslim immigrants, immediately became the frontrunner to lead America's largest city. Indeed, he would go on to win in a landslide victory. His democratic socialist platform gave political opponents plenty to attack. But in the aftermath of his victory, many on the far right focused instead on his religion, connecting Islam itself to the deadliest terrorist attack ever carried out on American soil, an event that occurred when Mamdani was just 10 years old. Donald Trump Jr. posted that New York City has fallen, while sharing another message that read, "I'm old enough to remember when New Yorkers endured 9/11 instead of voting for it." Marjorie Taylor Greene posted an image of the Statue of Liberty wearing a burqa with the caption, "This hits hard." America did come together after the largest terrorist attack in its history, first in shock, then in confusion, both entirely understandable. But eventually the country reacted in rage, projecting hatred with the broadest brush possible before finally beginning the long process of understanding what had happened and deciding how to respond. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon the terrorist Osama Bin Laden. Episode number 5, the 9/11 attacks. The question that almost always begins classroom discussions about 9/11 is simple. Where were you when the towers were hit? As a junior in college, there weren't many days when I woke up before 9 a.m., but on September 11th, 2001, I came upstairs to find two of my roommates watching the news, a rarity in that particular house. Still half asleep and rubbing my eyes, I was told that a plane had crashed into one of the World Trade Center towers in New York City. About 3 minutes later, I watched the second plane hit live on television. At 5:45 that morning, Mohammed Atta and Abdul Aziz Al-Omari passed through security at the Portland International Jetport in Maine. After a short layover, they boarded American Airlines Flight 11 in Boston. The flight was headed to California, carrying 76 passengers, 11 crew members, and 5 hijackers. 16 minutes later, United Airlines Flight 175 departed Boston with another 51 passengers, 9 crew members, and yet another team of 5 al-Qaeda operatives. The idea of using airplanes as weapons wasn't new to Al-Qaeda. Tom Clancy had already imagined a similar scenario in his 1994 novel Debt of Honor, while bin Laden himself had previously weaponized trucks and speedboats for earlier attacks. The concept for 9/11 came from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the uncle of Ramzi Youssef, the man behind the 1993 World Trade Center bombing attempt. Early discussions centered around two possibilities: blowing up a dozen airliners in midair or crashing a small plane into CIA headquarters. Bin Laden altered the second proposal. Why use a small plane, he asked, when you could use a passenger jet? In his words, why do you use an axe when you can use a bulldozer? The National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Response to Terrorism later analyzed jihadist plots against the United States between 1993 and 2017. They found that 82% were either fully or partially disrupted through surveillance or infiltration. Only 15 out of the 121 jihadist-linked plots against the American homeland were considered completely successful, a success rate of roughly 12%. At its core, terrorism is not random violence. It's violence with a purpose, almost always political. Terrorist groups are not simply trying to kill people, they're trying to send a message. Attacks that are too small fail to generate attention, while attacks that are too large often backfire, uniting opposition and making political goals impossible to achieve. Understanding the need for that balance helps governments anticipate attacks, and sometimes stop them before they happen. So what exactly did bin Laden want from the United States? Michael Scheuer, the former head of the bin Laden task force, identified 5 core demands. First, an end to American support for Israel and acceptance of the destruction of the Jewish state. Second, the removal of Western military forces from the Arabian Peninsula and other Muslim lands. Third, an end to U.S. support for what bin Laden viewed as the oppression of Muslims by Russia, China, and India. Fourth, the end of American backing for secular and authoritarian governments throughout the Middle East. And fifth, oil prices return to market or above market levels. In search of what he believed was the terrorist sweet spot, bin Laden scaled Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's original proposal down from 10 hijacked planes to 4. With hindsight, we know the attacks triggered a global war on terror, expanded government surveillance, reduced civil liberties, and helped pave the way for the Second Gulf War. But bin Laden didn't expect that response. As we discussed in earlier episodes, he had convinced himself that America was a paper tiger, powerful from a distance but weak up close. His decision to disappear into Afghanistan before the attacks was meant to avoid what he assumed would be the standard American response: cruise missile strikes. After all, that had been Washington's reaction after the embassy bombings in Africa, as well as the attack on the USS Cole. Even the targets themselves were chosen carefully. The World Trade Center towers were far more than office buildings. From the beginning, they were designed as symbols of American ambition. Commissioned by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, the towers were meant to showcase the United States as the center of global trade and finance. The goal was not simply to build the tallest buildings in the world, it was to send a message. American capitalism stood above all else. By the early 2000s, the World Trade Center had become a hub of international commerce, housing major banks, financial firms, and multinational corporations. The towers represented globalization, economic power, and American influence. They weren't just buildings, they were symbols. The Pentagon carried a different meaning. As headquarters of the Department of Defense, it represented American military power, the command center of the most powerful armed forces on Earth. Bin Laden understood that the true nerve center of the building was buried deep underground and hardened against even nuclear attack. The symbolism mattered more than the physical damage itself. Then there was United Flight 93. Thanks to the passengers who fought back, the plane never reached its destination. But intelligence gathered afterwards suggested the target was likely either the White House or the U.S. Capitol building. Both represented American political authority. Whether the goal was the executive branch or the legislative branch hardly mattered. The message was the same: economic power, military power, political power. Taken together, the targets reveal the logic behind the attacks. Bin Laden did not simply want to kill Americans. He wanted to strike at the foundations of American global influence and make sure that the entire world watched it happen. The 9/11 attacks had been set in motion years before the hijackers ever boarded their planes. And even within jihadist circles, there were warnings that bin Laden was going too far. Historian Peter Bergen writes that Norman Benjamin, a leader of the London-based Libyan Islamic fighting group, told bin Laden that his calls to attack the United States were crazy. Bin Laden and some other al-Qaeda leaders smirked when Benjamin said, "America will attack the whole region if you launch another attack against it." Benjamin also noticed that al-Qaeda's top religious advisor privately agreed with him. Even within al-Qaeda's leadership, there were fears about provoking the United States directly. But bin Laden remained calm, almost unnervingly so. Bergen writes that he possessed a serene, unshakable belief that the United States was weak, convinced that any American response would be limited to cruise missile strikes or another failed assassination attempt. Bin Laden told his military commanders, "I have one more operation, and after that I will quit. I can't call this one back because that would demoralize the whole organization." The operation itself began in early 1999. By April, the selected hijackers had started obtaining passports and visas for travel to the United States. Over the next 2 years, they gradually arrived in America on tourist visas. And like many tourists, they arrived carrying large amounts of cash and traveler's checks. While living in the United States, several of the hijackers began appearing on the radar of American intelligence agencies. The problem was that those agencies were barely speaking to one another. Each intelligence organization competed for the same pool of congressional funding, creating an environment where cooperation was often secondary to bureaucratic survival. A public congressional hearing in 2004 revealed just how fragmented and unprepared the U.S. intelligence community truly was, despite mounting evidence of a growing terrorist threat. The FBI had formally declared national security and counterterrorism to be top priorities as early as 1998, but in practice, very little changed. Most agents remained focused on traditional criminal investigations such as drug trafficking and white-collar crime. On September 11th itself, only around 6% of FBI personnel were assigned to counterterrorism duties, even after the Bureau's counterterrorism budget had tripled since the 1990s. The issue wasn't simply bureaucratic laziness, it was systemic dysfunction. Intelligence agencies competed against one another for resources and recognition, making them reluctant to share information. FBI Director Louis Freeh resisted reallocating agents towards counterterrorism unless additional funding was provided, while requests for those resources were frequently delayed, denied, or misunderstood by both Congress or the Department of Justice. Even agents assigned to terrorism investigations were regularly pulled away to support high-profile criminal cases. Interagency rivalry and a lack of political urgency meant that counterterrorism remained understaffed and underprioritized, even as the threat environment steadily worsened. And then there was something known simply as the wall. This legal and procedural barrier restricted communication between intelligence investigators and criminal prosecutors. It had originally been designed to prevent abuse of surveillance powers and protect civil liberties. But in practice, it crippled coordination inside the Justice Department itself, making it far harder to connect intelligence leads with actionable criminal investigations. In other words, the dots existed. The government just struggled to connect them. The 19 hijackers legally entered the United States a total of 33 times through 10 different airports. The plot could have unraveled at multiple points along the way. One potential break came when Ziad Jarrah failed to properly change his immigration status from tourist to student. Jarrah was one of 3 hijackers enrolled at a Florida flight school, where an instructor eventually contacted the FBI after noticing that several students seemed strangely uninterested in learning how to land the plane. Another warning emerged in Phoenix, Arizona. There, an FBI memo raised concerns that a local flight school might be tied to a coordinated effort by Osama Bin Laden to send operatives into the United States for aviation training. In the aftermath of 9/11, congressional hearings heavily scrutinized America's visa system. Despite the intense fixation on the southern border, roughly half of all undocumented immigrants enter legally through airports before overstaying their visas. The hearings highlighted one particularly chilling conclusion from the 9/11 Commission. For terrorists, travel documents are as important as weapons. 4 of the hijackers had overstayed their visas, missed opportunities that might have prevented an attack which ultimately killed nearly 3,000 people. The National Security Agency, or NSA, had identified intelligence related to 3 of the hijackers as early as 1999. 2 of them, Khalid al-Mindhar and Naraf al-Hamzi, even maintained extensive contact with a longtime FBI counterterrorism informant while living in San Diego beneath NSA surveillance. Former Department of Defense Inspector General Eleanor Hill later investigated why intelligence agencies failed to stop the attacks. She testified that the informant could have been tasked to surveil or approach those individuals to get more information. Frankly, who knows what would have happened? This was in 2000, long before the 9/11 attacks. As a former prosecutor, to me, that was perhaps the single biggest opportunity they had to break this whole plot open long before the attacks of 9/11. But no one connected those dots. Even so, airport security should have acted as a final safeguard. Metal detectors, gate screenings, airline personnel, all of it existed as a last barrier between the hijackers and their targets. And the plan itself was extraordinarily ambitious. 4 separate teams of 5 men each had to pass through airport security, hijack their respective aircrafts, seize control of the cockpit, and successfully strike their targets before the U.S. military could respond. Historian Giles Kepler later described 9/11 as a seismic event with incalculable consequences. What remains haunting is not just the scale of the attack, but how calmly and efficiently the hijackers moved through America's final line of defense. Not through overwhelming force, but by exploiting a system that was never designed for the kind of threat they represented. Gaetano Joe Ilardi of Australia's Global Terrorism Research Centre writes that The 9/11 attacks on New York and Washington, D.C. were undoubtedly the most brazen and shocking terrorist attacks conducted by a sub-state group in history. Al-Qaeda's capacity to achieve this outcome depended in large part on its meticulous intelligence and counterintelligence preparations. Those preparations created a dangerous level of confidence among the hijackers. Velarde argues that Al-Qaeda's security measures were so effective that the operatives felt comfortable continuing the mission even when unexpected problems arose, situations that easily could have exposed the entire plot. In the days leading up to the attacks, 3 hijackers received speeding tickets from local police. None panicked, none behaved suspiciously. The officer who pulled over Ziad Jarrah later recalled that he was extremely calm and cooperative throughout the entire traffic stop. Some of the hijackers were so confident that they voluntarily interacted with law enforcement. Al-Hamzi, Mohammed Atta's second-in-command, reported an attempted street robbery to Virginia police just 4.5 months before the attacks. All 19 hijackers were deeply committed to jihad, but most knew very little about the broader operational plan. Bin Laden may have had political goals, but according to Peter Bergen, the hijackers themselves were religious fanatics burning with the belief that they were doing God's will. They believed that their mass murder on the morning of Tuesday, September 11, 2001, was an act of worship. Much has been made of the idea that Islamic martyrs are automatically rewarded in heaven with 72 virgins. That belief stems from a text attributed to Imam al-Tirmidhi, who wrote that a martyr has 7 special favors from Allah. Among those rewards, forgiveness of sins, protection from judgment, and marriage to, quote, 72 wives from the beautiful maidens of paradise. The problem is that Islam is highly decentralized. Individual clerics can issue their own religious rulings, and Bin Laden spent years shopping his arguments around to different scholars before finding some willing to endorse violence against America. More importantly, the famous 72 virgins concept appears nowhere in the Quran itself. It is absent from many versions of the Hadith, doesn't align cleanly with broader Islamic teachings, raises obvious theological contradictions, and is far less universally accepted within Islam than many Americans assume. And while we can never fully know the hijackers' inner thoughts, it is highly unlikely they boarded those planes fantasizing about heavenly rewards. They approached the operation with a cold, disciplined professionalism that helped it succeed. That confidence came from repetition and practice. The hijackers took multiple practice flights in the months before the attacks. At one point, 2 of them even drew attention after using stopwatches to measure the time between takeoff and cruising altitude. A 2004 Senate hearing later concluded that the plan required all the hijackers to successfully board the aircraft. If several failed to board, their operational plan would fall apart. Investigators believe the hijackers repeatedly tested airport screening procedures beforehand to make sure their tactics would work regardless of which airport they used or who was screening them. The final conclusion was devastatingly simple. They did not count on a sloppy screener. They counted on beating a weak system. And they did. All 19 hijackers passed through airport security successfully. 19 for 19, 100%. I can personally attest to how weak the system was before 9/11. In 1998, as a 17-year-old, I flew to debate camp at the University of Kansas. My debate partner and I brought box cutters with us so we could quickly trim evidence packets into a more usable format for competition. At the time, we were obsessed with winning a national championship, and carrying box cutters onto a plane barely registered as unusual. We passed through security without issue. About an hour before boarding, airport security approached us at the gate and asked to inspect our bags. They pulled out the box cutters, extended the blades to test their sharpness, asked why we had them, and then simply told us not to open them during the flight. That was it. In 1998, I boarded an airplane carrying a box cutter. In 2001, the 9/11 hijackers used box cutters to take control of 4 planes. At the time, airport security guidelines left the decision up to individual screeners whether to confiscate box cutters brought through checkpoints. Pocket utility knives with blades shorter than 4 inches were explicitly allowed onto aircraft. At Washington Dulles International Airport, 4 of the hijackers triggered metal detectors. In every instance, they were either sent through another detector or checked with a handheld wand before eventually being cleared without further questioning. From there, according to congressional testimony, the hijackers faced no remaining significant security obstacles. The Federal Air Marshal Program was focused almost entirely on international flights. Cockpit doors were not reinforced, and gaining access to the cockpit was not considered especially difficult. Flight crews were trained not to resist hijackers. The priority was to land the aircraft safely and negotiate afterward. In fact, crews were specifically trained to discourage passengers from taking heroic or impulsive action. That mindset existed because up until that point, hijackings were generally political hostage situations. Terrorists typically seize planes to demand prisoner exchanges or political concessions. That had been the case in 1968 when the Palestinian Liberation Organization diverted an airliner to Algeria. Once the plane landed, negotiations began. If talks failed, special forces would eventually attempt a rescue operation designed to minimize civilian casualties. In that incident, the Red Cross helped broker an exchange of 100 hostages for 37 Palestinian prisoners. The first 2 hijacked flights departed Boston just 16 minutes apart. Only 20 minutes into American Airlines Flight 11, flight attendant Betty Ann Ong managed to alert ground personnel that the aircraft had been hijacked and that the cockpit was inaccessible. Her call was the first real indication that September 11th was about to become a day that would live in infamy. Her exact words were, "The cockpit is not answering. Somebody stabbed in business class and I think there's mace and we can't breathe. I don't know. I think we are getting hijacked." Confirmation came at 8:24 a.m. when Mohammed Atta accidentally transmitted a message to Boston Air Traffic Control instead of to the passengers on the plane. His words were chillingly calm. "We have some planes. Just stay quiet and you'll be okay. We are returning to the airport." And yet, despite the unfolding crisis, normal air traffic continued. At 8:42 a.m., 18 minutes after Boston controllers had been alerted to the hijacking, United Flight 93 took off from Newark, New Jersey, headed for California. On board were 33 passengers, 7 crew members, and 4 hijackers. 4 minutes after Flight 93 became airborne, American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Everyone on board was killed instantly, and everyone above the 91st floor inside the tower became trapped. When I first woke up and heard that a plane had struck the World Trade Center, I assumed I was witnessing a terrible accident. I remember wondering aloud, how does a pilot miss a building that big? Had it remained an accident, it still would have been the defining news story of the year. In New York, the city that never sleeps, it immediately became must-see television. News organizations rushed cameras to the scene by land, sea, and helicopter, broadcasting live images of smoke pouring from the North Tower. And because of that, cameras were already rolling when 17 minutes later, the second plane slammed into the South Tower. The moment that second impact happened, everyone watching understood the same thing instantly. This was not an accident. This was an attack. George W. Bush had been president for less than 9 months. On the morning of September 11th, he happened to be visiting an elementary school classroom in Florida, participating in a reading event with students. At 9:05 a.m., Chief of Staff Andrew Card approached the president and whispered into his ear, "A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack." You can actually watch Bush's face tighten as the realization sets in. But he did not immediately stand up or leave the room. Instead, he remained seated and finished the story. Later, Bush explained the decision this way: "I made the decision not to jump up immediately and leave the classroom. I didn't want to rattle the kids. I wanted to project a sense of calm. I had been in enough crises to know that the first thing the leader has to do is project calm." Bush had entered the school already aware that a plane had hit the first tower. But like much of the country, his staff initially assumed it was an accident. White House Communications Director Dan Bartlett later recalled the president saying, "The weather must be bad up there or something. Keep me posted." Once Bush finished the event and declined questions, Secret Service agents rushed him from the school. Mike Morrell, the CIA officer responsible for delivering the president's daily intelligence briefing, feared that another hijacked aircraft might target the school itself. Bush's visit had been publicly announced weeks in advance. The president was already inside the motorcade when, at 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon. That flight had departed Dulles Airport at 8:20 a.m., just 1 minute after Betty Ann Ong first reported her hijacking. Every life lost that morning mattered. And I don't mean this callously, but the Pentagon could have suffered even greater devastation. The hijackers failed to strike deeper than the structure, and instead crashed into the ground just outside the western side of the building. The impact and explosion killed all 53 passengers and 6 crew members aboard the aircraft, while debris and fire tore into the Pentagon itself. An additional 125 military and civilian personnel inside the building were killed. The fires burned for days. An Air National Guard pilot flying a Lockheed C-130 Hercules nearby had begun tracking the aircraft moments earlier. He was forced to radio back the unimaginable. "Looks like that aircraft crashed into the Pentagon, sir." Finally, at 9:45 a.m., the United States shut down all domestic airspace under Operation Yellow Ribbon. Every civilian aircraft in the country was ordered to land immediately at the nearest airport. 10 minutes later, Air Force One, carrying the President of the United States, was airborne, receiving updates about which planes across the country were complying with the emergency order. 12 minutes after that, United Flight 93 crashed into an empty field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Investigators later concluded that the likely target was either the White House or, failing that, the United States Capitol building. By then, the attack itself was over, but the horror was just beginning. 3 minutes earlier, the South Tower of the World Trade Center had collapsed. High school students are obsessed with conspiracy theories, not necessarily because they believe them, but because they feel forbidden. So whenever I teach 9/11, students inevitably bring up 2 theories. First, that the Twin Towers were secretly demolished from the inside. Second, that the government shot down Flight 93. For continuity's sake, let's deal with the second claim first. I have no doubt that the US government did not shoot down Flight 93 with fighter jets. I also have zero doubt that the government would have shot it down had it reached Washington airspace. And yes, I'll qualify both of those statements. Flight 93 was unique in several ways. Most obviously, it was the only hijacked plane that never reached its intended target. It was also in the air the longest. The two planes that struck New York were airborne for 47 and 48 minutes. The flight that hit the Pentagon lasted 77 minutes. Flight 93 remained airborne for 80 minutes before crashing into a field in Pennsylvania. And during that extra time, something changed. We know from phone records and testimony that passengers aboard the hijacked planes called loved ones after the attacks began. In fact, the hijackers intentionally allowed many of those calls. Reassuring passengers was part of the strategy. If people stayed calm, they stayed compliant. But by the time calls began coming from Flight 93, the situation had changed dramatically. Loved ones on the ground informed passengers that planes were being deliberately crashed into buildings. By 10 a.m. that morning, both towers of the World Trade Center had already been burning for nearly an hour. Given what we understood about hijackings at the time, I imagine I would have done exactly what most passengers initially did. Stay calm, follow instructions, and wait for the plane to land so authorities could handle the situation. We all like to imagine ourselves as heroes, but if I'm being honest, there's very little in the first 45 years of my life that suggests I would voluntarily charge 4 or 5 armed men holding knives. But if I knew that staying seated meant certain death, then I would hope I'd fight, not out of heroism, but survival. And that's exactly what the passengers aboard Flight 93 did. Cockpit recordings and flight data strongly suggest the passengers managed to retake control of the cabin, forcing the hijackers to barricade themselves inside the cockpit. Locked out, the passengers began using a beverage cart as a battering ram in a desperate attempt to break through the door. Inside the cockpit, panic set in. The hijackers violently rolled the plane side to side in an attempt to throw the passengers off balance. Their final recorded words are frantic and terrified. They want to get in here. Hold from the inside, hold from the inside. Then, is that it? Shall we finish it off? And finally, pull it down, cut off the oxygen. The 33 passengers and 7 crew members aboard United Flight 93 are heroes. They may not have succeeded in retaking the aircraft, but they almost certainly saved hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives on the ground. Their sacrifice does not deserve to be diminished by conspiracy theories claiming their own government murdered them and covered it up. That said, the government absolutely would have shot the plane down had it remained airborne long enough to threaten another target. In fact, President Bush issued exactly that order, 16 minutes after Flight 93 crashed. The problem was that those aboard Air Force One still mistakenly believed Flight 93 was in the air. And honestly, that order makes grim practical sense. There is no realistic way to retake a hijacked aircraft mid-flight. The only option would be to give passengers every possible chance to regain control. And if that failed, bring the plane down somewhere with the least possible loss of life. The second thing students always focus on is how the Twin Towers collapsed vertically rather than toppling over. But before we answer that question, we need to spend a moment talking about the extraordinary response from New York's first responders. American Airlines Flight 11 slammed into the North Tower between floors 93 and 99. Instantly, every stairwell above the 92nd floor became impassable. According to the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States, a jet fuel fireball erupted upon impact and shot down at least one bank of elevators. The explosion spread, burning fuel through the building, including lower floors, the lobby, and even 4 stories underground. Thick black smoke immediately engulfed the upper portion of the tower. The emergency response system was overwhelmed almost instantly. People calling for help received conflicting instructions. Some were told to head upward towards the roof for evacuation. Others were told to begin descending. Officials repeatedly urged people to remain calm, partly because many injuries during the 1993 World Trade Center bombing had occurred during panicked evacuations. Then, 6 minutes before the second plane struck, the New York Fire Department made the decision to proactively evacuate the South Tower as well. No one on the ground imagined another aircraft was incoming. Inside the North Tower, FDNY chiefs quickly realized they were facing an almost impossible situation with almost no reliable information. They didn't know exactly where the plane had struck. They didn't know which stairwells were still intact. They didn't know whether the standpipe system still had water pressure. What they did know was horrifying. Elevators had exploded into the lobby. Civilians were trapped above the impact zone. Others were already jumping from the upper floors. Tens of thousands of people could still be inside the building. Very early on, FDNY leadership made a critical decision. This was no longer a firefighting operation. It was a rescue mission. The fires stretched across enormous sections of multiple floors. Each floor of the tower was roughly the size of a football field. There was simply no realistic way to extinguish a blaze of that scale with the resources available. So firefighters climbed upwards anyway. They climbed knowing conditions could become fatal. They climbed because saving people was still possible. And they climbed under the belief, reinforced by structural experts, that while portions of the upper floors might collapse, the towers themselves were unlikely to fall completely. No one believed the entire buildings would come down. Then the second plane hit. Instantly, the scale of the disaster doubled, and the firefighters and police officers who fought their way towards the upper floors encountered yet another nightmare: locked doors. The computerized security system designed to automatically unlock doors during emergencies had been destroyed in the explosions. After 9:59 a.m., when the South Tower collapsed in just 10 seconds, chaos swept across lower Manhattan. Civilians and emergency personnel inside the tower were killed instantly. Others died in the concourse below, in the nearby Marriott Hotel, and on the surrounding streets. The building imploded into itself, unleashing a hurricane force wall of dust, steel, glass, and debris. The collapse severely damaged the Marriott and wiped out multiple emergency command posts, including those inside the North Tower lobby and nearby staging areas. And yet, even in the middle of that devastation, the rescue effort continued. Inside the North Tower, 911 calls were becoming increasingly desperate. Some civilians remained alive as high as the 79th and 92nd floors. Below the impact zone, most people who were physically able had already begun descending. Many only made it out because firefighters, police officers, and Port Authority personnel stayed behind to guide them to safety. When the South Tower collapsed, firefighters high inside the North Tower heard an enormous roar. Some were thrown off their feet. Stairwells shook violently. Emergency lights flickered on. Dust and debris blasted upward through the building. But many of them had no idea what had actually happened. Without windows, sight lines, or outside communication, some assumed there had been another explosion. Others thought part of the North Tower itself had collapsed. Very few understood the horrifying truth that an entire 110-story skyscraper had just disappeared. Because FDNY command posts had been destroyed in the South Tower collapse, evacuation orders spread slowly and unevenly through the North Tower. A fireboat in the Hudson immediately radioed that the South Tower had fallen, but no one on scene heard the transmission. Still, less than a minute after the collapse, a chief inside the North Tower lobby issued an evacuation order. Command to all units in Tower 1, evacuate the building. Another chief repeated the order moments later over a different channel. But the communication lacked the urgency normally used for an imminent structural collapse. There were no repeated Mayday warnings. Most critically, many firefighters never heard the one piece of information that mattered most. The South Tower was already gone. That reality simply never reached large portions of the building. Some chiefs higher in the tower did receive the message and acted immediately. One chief on the 23rd floor began organizing a full evacuation of the area. Another on the 35th floor finally learned over the radio that the South Tower had collapsed. He grabbed a bullhorn, moved between stairwells, and screamed the warning over and over. All FDNY, get the bleep out. That urgency saved lives. Firefighters who had paused to rest or continued helping civilians finally began moving downward. But communication failures were everywhere. Some radios simply could not receive signals inside the tower. Others were overwhelmed by radio traffic. Off-duty firefighters who had rushed in to help often had no radios at all. And some crews were still tuned to the South Tower's tactical channel, unaware their building had already collapsed. Even when evacuation orders were received, not everyone left immediately. Some firefighters refused to abandon injured civilians who couldn't walk. Others waited for missing team members before descending. In one heartbreaking instance, firefighters who had already reached the lobby were convinced to go back upstairs to search for missing personnel. Others simply sat down to rest as exhausted companies moved past them towards the exits. And some refused to leave because other firefighters were still inside. The bond between those first responders ran deep. Many would not abandon their brothers, even if it meant sacrificing themselves. By 10:24 a.m., several FDNY units had finally reached the bottom of Stairwell B and entered the North Tower lobby. There was no command structure left, no clear direction, just confusion. One firefighter who had personally witnessed the South Tower collapse warned everyone that they needed to get out immediately because the North Tower could come down next. The group finally began moving towards West Street. They had only minutes left. At 10:28 a.m., just 4 minutes after those firefighters entered the lobby, the North Tower collapsed. Some of the firefighters who had just escaped were killed in the street outside. Others still inside the building perished where they stood. Al-Qaeda had staggered the attacks to inflict maximum psychological damage on the American people. Not only was I watching the news when the second plane hit, I was still there when we learned about the Pentagon, about United Flight 93, and finally when the South Tower collapsed into itself. That collapse shocked the world, not just because of the scale of destruction, but because of how it happened. The buildings didn't topple over like trees. They fell straight down, floor by floor, one level pancaking onto the next in a rapid, catastrophic sequence. People still ask, why didn't the towers fall sideways? How could two of the tallest buildings in the world, steel and concrete, essentially disintegrate vertically? Let's break it down. First, scale matters. The aircraft were large, but compared to the towers, they were not. The twin towers weighed more than 1,000 times the planes that struck them. And they were designed to withstand wind loads far greater than the force of an aircraft impact. So the impact alone, devastating as it was not enough to bring them down. But the planes didn't just hit the buildings. They stripped away fireproofing material from steel trusses and columns. That protection mattered. Without it, the steel was exposed. Then came the fire. Thousands of gallons of jet fuel ignited office contents across multiple floors. Steel doesn't need to melt to fail. It weakens significantly under extreme heat. The initial impact also severed key support columns. In a structure like this, when some columns fail, their load shifts to others. That's why the towers remained standing after impact. The system redistributed stress. It bought time. It also created the illusion of stability. But inside, the fire kept spreading. According to FEMA, the heat caused floor trusses to expand and sag. As they bowed, they pulled inward on the exterior columns. At the same time, the floor systems had nowhere to go. Steel resisted outward movement. Stress built. Connection began to fail. Then one floor gave way. It dropped onto the floor below, and a chain reaction began. This is called progressive collapse, and once it starts, it does not stop. Each floor was never designed to absorb the sudden mass and force of the one above it. One by one, the structure failed downward. That's why it looked like a demolition, not because of explosives, but because of physics under extreme stress. Investigations by FEMA, NIST, and independent engineers all reached the same conclusion. Fire-induced structural failure triggered by impact damage caused the collapses. The South Tower fell first in part because it was struck at an angle, causing more widespread damage and dislodging more fireproofing. The collapse of the North Tower followed shortly after. Debris from both buildings also contributed to the later failure of World Trade Center 7, often referred to as Building 7, which collapsed later that afternoon due to uncontrolled fire. These were not just mechanical failures. They were failures of imagination. Before 9/11, engineers understood localized damage. They did not fully anticipate progressive collapse on this scale in modern skyscrapers. After 9/11, building codes changed. Emergency protocols changed. The understanding of structural risk changed. But the core lesson remained simple. Fire combined with structural damage can bring down even the strongest buildings. There is a persistent conspiracy theory that conflates a few facts: that the 1993 bombing didn't collapse the towers, and that jet fuel burns below the melting point of steel. Both are technically true, but they miss the key point. Steel does not need to melt to fail. Thomas Eager, a professor of engineering at MIT, has explained that steel can lose roughly half its strength at around 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, well within the range reached in uncontrolled office fires fed by jet fuel and building contents. Once the fire spread across multiple floors, temperatures were more than sufficient to cause structural deformation and failure. And yet, despite all of this being visible in real time, conspiracy theories still emerged almost immediately. People like me were watching unfold on live television. The impacts, the fires, the evacuations, the collapse, the rescue efforts. And still, some people concluded that it wasn't Al-Qaeda at all, but a controlled demolition carried out by the US government. At the heart of that theory is a single claim: that 9/11 was orchestrated to justify war in Iraq. But here's the reality. The Bush administration did not need to manufacture a tragedy of this scale to pursue military action against Saddam Hussein. It relied on intelligence claims, most infamously around weapons of mass destruction and yellow-cake uranium, to build its case for war. That campaign succeeded not because 9/11 was an inside job, but because a real tragedy was politically exploited. And from the very beginning, U.S. intelligence agencies identified Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda as responsible. Bin Laden himself repeatedly claimed responsibility. There is no credible evidence supporting government orchestration of the attacks. None. Still, the theory spread and it stuck. And that reveals something larger than the attacks themselves. 9/11 didn't just reshape foreign policy. It reshaped how people relate to truth. As PolitiFact has noted, the attacks helped accelerate a broader culture of conspiratorial thinking, one that moved from the margins into mainstream discourse. Suddenly, anyone with a dial-up connection and a copy of Loose Change, a viral documentary riddled with inaccuracies, could claim expertise and convince others that they had uncovered the real truth. These early 9/11 conspiracies laid the groundwork for how misinformation spreads today, through emotionally charged narratives, distrust of institutions, and the illusion of doing your own research. From 9/11 was an inside job to QAnon to COVID-19 denialism, we can trace a straight line from the collapse of the Twin Towers to the collapse of shared reality. The idea that nothing is what it seems and that every tragedy must be orchestrated has become a recurring theme in modern life. And that's not just unsettling, it's dangerous. Because the more we allow conspiracy to replace evidence, the harder it becomes to act together as a society. And in moments of real crisis, like 9/11, clarity, trust, and truth can be the difference between life and death. President Bush addressed the nation from the Oval Office on the evening of September 11th. Keep in mind, he was only 9 months into his first term. His election remained controversial after a Supreme Court ruling stopped the Florida recount before it could be completed. Later scholars revisited the vote and finished the count, confirming that Bush had narrowly won the Electoral College, despite receiving fewer popular votes than Vice President Al Gore. Like many of the sons of wealthy public figures, George W. Bush struggled under the weight of public scrutiny. In 1976, he received a DUI. By 1985, he had begun to reevaluate his life. After becoming a born-again Christian, the Associated Press reports that in astonishingly rapid sequence, Bush quit drinking, unloaded his failing oil exploration company, helped run his father's presidential campaign, organized the purchase of the Texas Rangers baseball team and operated the business, defeated Texas incumbent governor, and won the White House. I was one of the skeptical Americans watching the presidential address that evening. But Bush struck the chord the country needed to hear, clear, direct, without political abstraction. He began, "Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen, and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat, but they have failed. Our country is strong." He then tied the attacks to America's identity, freedom. Bin Laden, of course, rejected that framing entirely, arguing instead that he was attacking the United States because it was a global power that constrained Muslim societies and political autonomy. In that sense, freedom became both the rallying cry and the point of disagreement. Bush continued, "Today our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring of strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources to our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them." At that moment, America needed a leader willing to say it plainly. We are going to find them, and we are going to kill them. It is true that 9/11 brought out some of the best in America, but tragedy also exposes our worst impulses. Hate crimes against Arab Americans surged in the aftermath. Historian Erica Lee notes that many American Muslims have identified 9/11 as a turning point in their lives in the United States. There were detentions and roundups. Muslims and Sikhs mistaken for Muslims were attacked on the streets. Millions were targeted by harassment and bigotry. A national security response also followed, including registration programs and increased deportations. And as the war on terror expanded, it became harder for many Americans to distinguish between Islam, a global religion of over 1 billion people, and the small extremist minority that had weaponized it. In the years that followed, Islamophobia became institutionalized in new ways. Lee writes that it did not simply appear organically. It was carefully and passionately prompted through a well-funded network. She describes an Islamophobia industry made up of media figures, bloggers, politicians, religious leaders, and academics who amplified fear after 9/11. What had once been fringe rhetoric moved into mainstream discourse, reshaping public perception of Muslim Americans for years to come. 9/11 should not be absorbed into the machinery of culture war. It was, as Bush said, an act of evil carried out by evil men. Those men are gone, but the ideas that followed, fear, suspicion, and division, persist longer than any single attacker ever could. America is a nation of many races, ethnicities, and creeds. On that day, first responders did not stop to ask about faith or background before running into burning buildings. They acted on duty, not division, and yet many of them now feel forgotten. Some have seen their benefits reduced or programs delayed, including parts of the World Trade Center health program facing uncertainty in recent years, even as thousands continue to suffer long-term illnesses linked to that day. The average age of those first responders is now in the mid-50s, and cancer rates among them remain significantly elevated. Some projections suggest that long-term 9/11 related illnesses may ultimately claim more lives than the attacks themselves. That reality should sit heavily. America should do better than that, and it should also be better when a son of immigrants wins a major party nomination to lead one of its most important cities. Immigrant children growing up and choosing to serve this country is not an exception to the American story. It is the continuing American story. My father was once asked to lead community meetings during a closing of local churches. As you might expect, it brought out strong emotions. In one meeting, he overheard people speaking in anger, so much so that some suggested violence. Every teacher knows this distinction. Words and intent are not always the same thing, but you also can't ignore the small fraction where words turn into action. So my father calmly addressed it. He pointed out that if a community's response to loss becomes threats of harm, then something deeper needs to be examined, starting with the values they claim to hold. It changed the tone of the room, and the group was able to move forward together. America has its own core values: tolerance, acceptance, citizenship. As we continue to reflect on September 11th, it is those values, not fear, that should shape what we take from it. While it is a difficult subject, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on Bluesky beneath the handle EmpiresPod. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.